Okay, so what you just saw right there was a damage cap blast status damage, and I will explain exactly how we got to this point. So first, this build is a Mesa build where we don't use the Regulators ability. Instead, I committed the cardinal sin of taking off Regulators and putting another ability on top, and I will explain exactly why I did this. And this is mainly due to the first ability for Mesa. So without further ado, let's just do a quick rundown of all of Mesa's abilities. Okay, so Mesa's first ability is called Ballistic Battery. And what exactly does this ability do? Well, it adds base damage after your base damage mods are taken into account. So your usual base damage on a weapon is multiplied by, for instance, mods like Serration or Hornet Strike, but the base damage from Ballistic Battery that we can build up by triggering the ability, then building up our damage, and then triggering it again to then use the stored damage on the next damage instance that we deal, we can use this base damage increase, which happens after the first calculation with Hornet Strike and Serration, for instance, to increase our damage by a ton. And the reason why we can increase our damage by this much is because the base damage that is added is still influenced and multiplied by elemental damage, faction damage, critical damage, headshot damage, and even status damage. However, all of these damage increases only work for a single damage instance. So let's say you have a shotgun that shoots a bunch of different pellets. Only one pellet of that shotgun will benefit from this incredible damage buff. So this might get you to question, well, then why would I use multishot in the first place? And there is an edge case scenario with a weird quirk that I will get into where you actually do want a bunch of multishot. But first, let's go over the augment for the first ability, which is also important for this build. So the augment for the first ability is called Ballistic Bullseye, and what this will do is it will add 50% final critical chance, which can be increased by modding for ability strength to be way higher. And this 50% critical chance that you can get, or skilled higher with your ability strength, will be a flat critical chance bonus, which means that it is applied after all of your mods have been taken into account. So let's say you have a 200% final critical chance bonus from Ballistic Bullseye, you will always get an orange crit. Okay, so now we circle back to the beginning clip that I've showed you, where I was dealing damage cap with a blast proc. And the reason why I was using the Phantasma Prime in this clip, as some of you may have noticed, is that this weapon is a beam weapon, which at the same time has multi-shot. So circling back, the multi-shot, as I said, usually means that only one of these multiple shots gets the increased damage from your first ability, and the increased critical chance if you are using the augment. However, because we have a beam weapon, beam weapons use multishot in a quirky little way, where basically whenever you shoot your beam, it deals damage every so many seconds or like frames in the game. And what it will do is it will use your multishot value to calculate what this damage instance should be. So basically your multishot is multiplicative for the damage instance that you deal with a single beam. And what is funny is that Mesa's first ability, as well as the augment, so both the damage and the flat critical chance, get multiplied by this multishot on beam weapons. So if you have a beam weapon that has multishot, basically you can get your critical chance, which is, for instance, let's say a flat 200% critical chance. You can multiply this by your multishot. So let's say my Phantasma in a scenario has 20 multishot, which is not completely unheard of with the builds that I will show you. You will get a 20 times 200% critical chance, which is 4000% critical chance, which also means you get into tier 40 crits. And at this point, you can also sometimes see critical overflow. And this is a mechanic which is basically, it's a visual artifact where if your crit chance and your crit damage gets so high, it will actually look like you are dealing shield damage. So it will become a blue number, and it will also become a negative number. Now, as to why my blast damage status procs were dealing negative damage cap, I'm not entirely sure, because blast damage, status damage should not be able to crit. So maybe someone can enlighten me in the comments. But what it really boils down to is that with beam weapons that have multishot, you can absolutely juice the crap out of your first ability with Mesa's augment as well for it. Okay, so that pretty much covers everything about the first ability. Now let's have a look at the second ability as well, because this also increases our damage. So Mesa's second ability is called Shooting Gallery, and what Shooting Gallery will do is it will give extra damage, and it will also lock enemy guns for a small amount of time, and it will basically stun them in this animation where they sort of slap their guns like, hey, it's not working, what's going on? This animation is relatively long at base, but you can actually increase it with a slow effect. So let's say you have a cold stack on an enemy, or you have something like an enemy affected by Nova's molecular prime, which is slowing them down. This animation will take a really long time to complete, which is nice because it's crowd control, because in that case, enemies can't shoot you because they are fighting with their gun. This happens in a 16-meter base radius, which can be increased by modding for ability range. And the damage bonus that you get is 25% at base, which can be increased by ability strength. This damage bonus is a universal bonus. So what it means is it basically applies to all of your weapons, except for your melees. So it will buff primary weapons as well as secondary weapons. And this damage functions in the same, or this damage buff functions in the same way as a Hornet Strike or a Serration would on your build. And this damage increase, the Hornet Strike, is actually used to calculate blast status damage. So this is quite an important buff for your status damage output. If we then look at Mesa's third ability, Shatter Shield. Shatter Shield will give you damage reduction, which only functions on your health because it's not damage redirection. If you don't know the difference between damage reduction and damage redirection, you can check out my health tanking guide that I made quite a while ago. The base duration of this ability is 25 seconds, and it has a radius of 11 meters, and this basically means the radius in which enemy bullets can be reflected back to them, I believe. Now, what Shatter Shield does is it reflects, as I said, enemy bullets. However, these reflected enemy bullets have a weird quirk to them, which many people may not know, which is that once they are reflected, they are counted as something called unattributed damage, also known as miscellaneous damage, and I've also called it Schrodinger's damage in an older video, which I will link in the description as well, which goes a little bit more in depth about what unattributed damage really is. Again, as a quick rundown, unattributed damage basically means that the damage is coming from a source which the game cannot refer to where it came from. So it doesn't know if it's from a weapon, it doesn't know if it's from a damage ability, it doesn't know if it's from a melee or a primary or a secondary, it doesn't know anything. So what it then does is, instead of it saying, okay, well, then it's this other type of thing, it actually counts basically as everything at once. So if you are using certain arcanes, they can actually be triggered by this reflected damage, which is unattributed. And one of the arcanes that you can trigger is Secondary Fortifier. And I will show this a little bit later on, where you can actually trigger Secondary Fortifier if enemies that have Overguard are shooting you and you reflect the damage back at them. And this is quite nice because it means that you can build up your Overguard over time, and this also gives you the Overguard Gate, so another layer of survivability which you can stack on top of something like your Shield Gating, Arcane Aegis, or something like Arcane Persistence if you are health tanking instead. What is also funny about this is that Secondary Fortifier can be equipped anywhere. And it can even be equipped on the regulators on your build that you have taken away. It will still work. And what is also funny is you can actually stack it on top of other instances of Secondary Fortifier. So let's say you are running it on your regulators, and you are running it on your secondary, and you are also running it on your arc gun. Yes, that also works. You get 3 different instances of Secondary Fortifier that's able to trigger, so you get a bunch of Overguard generation. Which is funny, but the amount of Overguard doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that we get Overguard at all, because it gives us that 1 second of invulnerability once Overguard is depleted. Okay, then for the final ability that I chose for this build, I chose Roar. Other good options here are Zata's Whisper as well as Nourish if you want viral damage. I chose for Roar mainly because it's a faction damage increase, and it will increase the blast status damage twice. It will increase it once for the initial damage that we deal to the target, and then to calculate the status damage it will be used again. So that's why it's double dipping on the faction damage, which is very nice. As a quick side note, the blast status damage that we are dealing is also increased by the base damage that we are getting from Ballistic Battery, which is exactly why blast damage is so incredibly powerful and is also why you saw it dealing damage cap. Okay, so that's Mesa and her abilities. So let's get into some of the weapon builds. So as I said, I am using the Phantasma Prime because it has multishot and it is a beam weapon. What we want to build for mostly is I wanted to build around blast damage and specifically the blast status damage, so we get some more AoE clears, because that's the biggest drawback of getting away or getting rid of your regulators, means usually that you don't really have that much options to deal with a large number of enemies at once. So my idea was, okay, well, I can trigger this massive blast damage proc, which happens in an AoE, so I will compensate that way and still deal massive AoE damage without having to rely on regulators. So what we are using here for the Phantasma is mostly increases to our multishot, which is why I'm using Galvanized Hell, as well as Primary Blight. I then build for Toxin and Blast. Toxin is here to make sure that we can trigger Primary Blight. And this will both increase the critical damage and it will increase our multishot. Then we are using increases to our critical damage. So not only from Primary Blight, but also from Primed Ravage, which is very nice. The higher our critical damage is, the more insane our damage gets. And critical damage also influences this blast status damage that we get at the end. Because we are running at sometimes we are getting into like tier 50 crits, the critical damage multiplier will be multiplied by your critical tier as well. So the higher your critical chance, the higher your critical damage multiplier becomes as well. I then have Frigid Blast as well as Blaze. Blaze is an increase to our base damage as well as heat. So it gives us blast damage by combining cold and heat. We then use Shotgun Elementalist because this is a separate status damage increase from everything else. So this is multiplicative to all of the other stuff, which means crazy blast damage. I then used Galvanized Savvy. This increases our base damage and it also gives us some status chance. The base damage only applies to the first base damage of your weapon, but still any increase that we can get is very nice. And this base damage increase will also again work on the status damage that we put out. And then finally I have Toxic Barrage for the toxin damage to trigger Primary Blight, and I have Sinister Reach to get more range on the beams, so we don't have to be up close all of the time. So that's pretty much it. If you are looking, I also have the Bane mod, but if you are looking for something like a Riven, what I could recommend is critical damage as well as faction damage and multishot. And possibly if you want to, you could roll an element. So you could, for instance, roll either heat or cold to still get your blast status damage. Now this entire build can also be changed into cold gas, and then you can use Frostbite. So with Frostbite, it's basically the same as Primary Blight, but this has a slightly higher ceiling for the multishot and a slightly lower ceiling for the critical damage. Primary Frostbite can also be triggered by your companions, which Primary Blight can not be, so that's a benefit. The gas damage, however, is a little bit slower, and I personally just enjoy using blast damage as opposed to gas damage. But gas damage is definitely a good option here as well if you prefer that. Then we can go on to the secondary. And the secondary has quite a bit of options. You could also run a primer here. So you can run something like a Compressor Prime with secondary encumber to trigger a bunch of status effects for the increase of our Galvanized Savvy, which is on the Phantasma. However, what I personally enjoyed using as well is the Grimoire with this specific build, where I use the Foam invocation to get more ability strength. And this ability strength is really nice because it juices up the damage that we can store in the first ability, as well as the flat critical chance that we get, which is then multiplied by the multishot on our Phantasma. So it's every little bit of ability strength that we can get is nice and needed. Secondary Fortifier, as I said, this can trigger from Shatter Shield reflected damage, which is quite funny. For the melee, doesn't really matter at all what you are using. I'm using the Praedos. You don't really need any mods. This is pretty much all you need. It's nice to have Dispatch Overdrive for some extra movement speed, and then I use Melee Careen because this will freeze enemies, so it's a nice crowd control effect. And the freeze bonus, once an enemy is fully frozen, they will also be dealt increased critical damage. As I said, with the Regulators, it doesn't really matter. What I would probably do is run this. Doesn't matter what mods you have because you are not using them. But as I said, Secondary Fortifier is able to be triggered by Shatter Shield. Okay, then for the Mesa build, I guess I can go over the shards first. I am using 2 purple shards with the equilibrium effect here. This is to make sure that I have an option to, in this video at least, both show the health tanking build as well as the shield tanking build. In general, if you are using the shield tanking build, I would put 2 yellow Archon shards here for cast speed, and then these 3 crimson shards are all ability strength. As for the build, this is the shield gating build and this is the health tanking build. So I will go over the shield gating build first. For the shield gating build, we are using catalyzing shields. We have a negative efficiency, which means that our 1 will be able to instantly restore our shields. I also use brief respite for this, but this is not really needed. You could also use something like growing power for even more ability strength. I have precision intensify here because it nicely buffs our roar. Ballistic bullseye is the pinnacle and the absolute cornerstone of this build. Natural talent is here because I need some casting speed to have a nice cast speed for the 1, which I use to shield gate. Then for an extra layer of survivability, I use Arcane Aegis because we are shield gating, so I will have shields all of the time. So once the shields are damaged, at some point you will get a 12-second invulnerability period basically. Then for this other arcane that I'm using Molt Augmented. Molt Augmented is nice because it again increases our ability strength. However, another good option is Arcane Concentration, which increases your ability duration. And that means that you have to cast your Roar, your Shatter Shield and your Shooting Gallery a little bit less, which also means that your energy sustain will increase by quite a bit. However, you will lose your 60% ability strength buff. However, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really a huge deal to lose a little bit of strength because this is massive overkill anyway, as you will see in a little bit. Okay, so that was the shield tanking build. If we go to the health tanking build, another option instead of growing power is Worthy Camaraderie to further increase our critical chance on weak point hits. So for the health tanking build, I'm using Arcane Persistence, which means that we won't have shields at all. It also means that we want to increase our health pool a little bit, so I'm using a normal vitality, and we need to be able to trigger Arcane Persistence, which I am able to do with health conversion. Now, health conversion can easily be triggered by using a companion, which I will get into a little bit later. And if we want to survive using this health tanking build, we also need a way to regain our health, which I will also come to in a little bit, because that is all outsourced to our companion for the health tanking build specifically. Then I basically decided to drop the natural talent that was here, which in a perfect scenario, if you have cast speed on your shards, you actually on the shield tanking build run equilibrium here and not natural talent. On the health tanking build, however, we don't have the space to fit equilibrium, so I instead opted to go for the 2 purple shards. Focus school is Matter-Eye, doesn't really matter that much. You can choose any focus school that you want, but Matter-Eye gives some extra ability strength, which can be nice. Then for the companion. So this build is specifically for the shield tanking build. I'm using Viral Quills to get viral damage on enemies. Tenacious Bond is nice because it increases our critical damage, which synergizes with the whole critical theme. Seismic Bond actually works when you are charging your first ability, so you do get 30% extra ability efficiency, which is very nice to have, because that means that we can spam our abilities a little bit more often, which is very nice for the shield gating build in particular. What you do have to keep in mind is that if your efficiency increases, your shield tanking capability or like your shield generating capability will decrease a little bit, so either run more auger mods or swap back to using brief respite. I'm using Reinforced Bond because more fire rate is very nice on beam weapons, and this will also give our companion some overshields, which happens whenever we reload. And with the Phantasma Prime, you will see that we are reloading all of the time. Then in terms of the way we trigger health conversion, we do this with Synth Deconstruct. Synth Deconstruct will trigger after any enemy is tagged by viral quills, and it will then drop a health orb. If you are using the health tanking build, the only change that you have to make is you put Hunter Recovery here instead of Seismic Bond. So you will lose a little bit of efficiency. However, what you will gain back is that Hunter Recovery will basically instant heal you all of the time. Now, if you don't want to use something like a Beast Companion, and I will also show the class, the only thing that you really want is Bite, so you have your 50% critical chance for Tenacious Bond. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. But if you don't like using Beast Companions, you can also use a Nautilus build, which is this build specifically for priming. Here I use Duplex Bond as well as Manifold Bond. I use Cordon, which is able to group enemies together, which nicely synergizes with our Blast-themed build. So Duplex Bond is here to copy all of your Sentinels, and I then use the Tessicore, which is a very nice weapon to prime enemies. So the Tessicore is a beam weapon that can chain multiple enemies. So if you build this for something like Viral and Magnetic, you can nicely prime enemies with these status effects. And I will show you in a little bit exactly what this looks like. So I will get back to the shield gating build, and then I will give you a small demonstration. So let's get some enemies in. Here we go. We fire our Grimoire to get more strength. We sling at the ground because I'm using Madurai. We activate our buffs, and then we activate our Phantasma buff. And as you can see, it's already at 100% because of the electricity damage from our Grimoire. So we can deactivate it, shoot this guy, and deal damage cap. Very nice. This, however, is just the beginning because we haven't even built up any of our stacks. And once we do that, we deal critical overflow. So yeah, pretty nuts. What you may also notice is that you can just spam your first ability all of the time. So you can basically beam with your Phantasma, sort of spam your first ability, and then every now and then just an enemy evaporates and kills everything around it. So this is mega effective. Also in missions where you have a bunch of enemies, it's super effective. If you are doing single target, however, there's a completely different weapon that you can use. So this is the setup that I would use for the Phantasma, and with the multishot and beam weapon quirk. Another weapon that can do this is the Vermisplicer. This is a kit gun. I will show the build. I'm using the Gibber Grip, the Vermisplicer chamber, and the loader splat. What is nice about this is that Riven disposition is really high, so you can get insane multishot on this. What you can also do is, because this is a secondary, you can now use secondary outburst, which is a super big increase to your critical damage as well as critical chance, but we really use it for the critical damage. What you can then do is, if you are using the Vermisplicer, you can use the Ceramic Dagger. The Ceramic Dagger will have a bunch of initial combo, and especially with an initial combo build, Corrupt Charge, Covert Lethality, Galvanized Reflex, as well as all of the passive from the Incarnon effects that the Ceramic Dagger has, we can get relatively high increases instantly for our secondary outburst. So let's trigger this, and then we swap to our Vermisplicer. You can see that we have a 140% damage bonus. We build up our ballistic battery, and then we discharge it, and that was 156 million damage. So we can do it again, and we can do it again, and this is pretty effective too. So that's your other option. If you want to go the secondary route instead, you can also use the Vermisplicer. If we want to do single target, we can look at the Daikyu Prime. The base damage that you get from the first ability can be increased, as I said, by headshot damage. So stacking into the headshot damage multiplier with, for instance, Amalgam Daikyu target acquired is incredibly powerful. This is now also a lot more powerful on a health tanking build, because this specific target acquired mod gives us lifesteal on Nekanas, which is great. So now we could, for instance, swap this out for the Nautilus, then use our Nekana all the time to basically stay alive and still deal a lot of damage. And then if we run into a target that needs to be dealt with because it's incredibly powerful, like a Demolist in Disruption, we can simply switch to our Daikyu and take it down immediately. Now, instead of using the Grimoire, I would suggest switching to a compressor because we are more focused on this single target. So let's get a Demolist in here. So what you would do is you get all of your abilities going, you get your compressor, you prime up the enemy a little bit, and then we draw our bow and we deal big damage. Now, this is without having any stacks. So let's spawn a couple of these Demolists, prime them up, snipe them down, and do the same here. Make sure that we get our damage buff from the one. And that's 300 million damage right there. So it will take some finagling to make sure that you always have your one active. But luckily it's quite easily charged, as you can see. And we can deal millions of damage to Demolists. And this can easily go up to billions of damage in terms of regular units. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, another thing that I can note here at the end is that Acolytes absolutely hate this combo. The critical damage bypasses their damage attenuation formula, which means that you can insta-kill Acolytes with a Phantasma Prime with one beam to the head, which is very funny. Let's just jump into the gameplay. I will readjust my build a little bit and I will see you there. Okay, so here we are, my absolute favorite mission, a Circulus Survival. Being a fisher was online, which is perfect timing. So what we do first is we get our Grimoire buff up. Make sure that you keep your Grimoire out to actually trigger the foam mod. And now what we will do is kill some enemies, get some energy going, spend some energy as well to get our duplex bond. And you can already see that this build is wiping the floor with them. Even without having our big damage bursts, just the Phantasma Prime itself is a ridiculous gun. Another arcane that's really good on the Phantasma is a primary quirks, which will give you ammo efficiency as well as even more status chance, so even more blast damage procs. This is also very powerful. It's a little bit less total damage because you don't have the multishot and critical damage increase that primary blight is able to give you, but it's still very powerful. As you can see in the top right, our primary blight is pretty much active the entire time, which is great. Well, they are dead. Ah, there we are. The critical overflow. And again, so yeah, this is not a simulacrum only build. This stuff actually works in a mission, guys. It's actually decent. And as you can see, we are also now here and there getting some overguard due to the interaction with Shatter shield that I mentioned before. And our secondary fortifier. As you can see, it's super easy to I basically just hold one button and that's it. And then every now and then I trigger my one and I untrigger it if I see an Eximus unit or something that needs to be dealt with quickly. And once we have an Acolyte that shows up, you will also see how that Acolyte does not like this combo at all. The Panzerfill Profiler also helps a little bit more with your energy sustain, mostly because it drops so many health orbs. Okay, so here we are. This is regular damage without the damage instance triggered, and then here we go. Malice is gone. Easy as. But yeah, the longer you are in a mission, the more energy and health drops are on the ground, the more Eximus units you have killed, the easier all of this gets. As you can see, it's a very effective build. And the best part is we are not even using Regulators. I would say dealing negative damage caps is a good alternative, right? But this is about the time where the mission really starts heating up, and you can see that we are still doing more than fine. Let's get out of here. Let's go towards extraction and swap to the health tanking build, and with the Panzerfill Profiler equipped. Okay, well, back we are for another run. So what I like about the health tanking build is that Shatter Shields with its 95% damage reduction is actually very powerful for any health tanking build, especially using Arcane Persistence, because it means that our health regen doesn't necessarily have to be this 500 health per second. It can actually be a lot less, because we are also less damage is getting dealt to us, right? So that's pretty good. What I also like about the health tanking variant is that you have quite a bit of options in terms of other arcanes and cool combinations with your arcanes on your guns as well, as I've shown in the simulacrum with primary overcharge, for instance. But as you can see, this is Also, this version of the build is very performant, so it really boils down to what you like playing more. However, the general playstyle doesn't really change too much. It's still just spamming your one, making sure your abilities are up, every now and then casting your grimoire. What I do like a little bit less is that the Panzer has a relatively high down rate, so to say. It likes to lay on the floor like a carpet and not help out, but it's only really there to spread those viral quills, and then after it did that, I don't really care if it's down or not. Now, as you can see, if you get in some way, shape, or form silenced or your armor gets reduced, you are having a bad time on the health tanking build, which is in general why I like the shield gating build a little bit better. As you can see, very powerful stuff and a very quirky and weird interaction, which I mean, they may nerf it. I don't know if this is intended, but it only really works on like, I don't know, 3 to 4 weapons in total. So it's super niche and it's good, but it's not game-breakingly good, right? It's not killing enemies through walls and wiping entire tile sets within seconds. Even though looking at the gameplay right now, it can get close. Seeing entire groups of enemies just turn into XP points. But yeah, let's again go towards extraction. That's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. This is another spin on a Mesa build, which feels to me a little bit more innovative than the Regulator slop. If you enjoyed this build, or if you learned anything new, if I covered some new interactions, make sure to leave a like, as well as possibly subscribe for more Warframe content. And with all of that being said, I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.